Awesome. Okay, so it turns out if you try to unmute when you're not tabbed in, it doesn't work. So, hey, but we are there now, and hopefully you all can hear me okay. So what? Thank you to my thank you to Kenzie and to my predecessors for great presentations, all of you. Unfortunately, I won't have as many pretty pictures in mine as my predecessors, but don't worry, I'm going to tell you a story instead. I'm going to tell you a story about the Roman Empress Theodora, who was reigning alongside Justinian in the 6th century CE, so kind of at the opposite end of antiquity from where we've been at so far. But we know that women in general in antiquity have often been left out of the spotlight. Even elite women have been left out of the spotlight, and this has been well established for quite a long time. But this does not mean that there are no great stories of women from the ancient world. And one such story is that of Theodora, who was able to rise from the stages of the theater stages of Constantinople to the grandest stage of them all, the world stage, as Empress of the Eastern Roman Empire alongside her husband. I would argue that, and I'm hopefully going to show you today, that Theodora was in fact one of the most powerful female figures in all of antiquity, and I would argue that perhaps the most powerful figure we saw in history until like the likes of Queen Elizabeth I several centuries later. If we can flip the slide. Right, so I'm just going to talk first about Theodora's early life to give a little background about just how far she was able to go. The most prominent feature that we are told about Theodora's early life is it was her career as a stage performer. She is said to have been born to a bear keeper, as in fact in the amphitheater. So it almost fills the head with images of like what we would think of in a modern circus type of thing. And she went on to be a prolific stage performer in her own right, along with her siblings, of whom we know unfortunately quite little in comparison. There is some debate about whether she was an actress, a prostitute, or both. Since the word pornai typically refers to prostitutes, but can also refer to a group of actresses. So linguistically, it seemed that these two professions were seen as being quite similar. These two professions seem to have been quite equal in the eyes of the law as well, as a law from 536 equated sexual immorality with a life on stage. So basically, in the eyes of the law, they were considered no different, even though in practice they may have been very different. Justinian himself also stated in an earlier law that whosoever returned to a life on stage after leaving it was committing a crime of unchastity. So we can see that the views of stage performers, especially female stage performers in this era, were not exactly positive. But on the flip side, it is important to note that a career as a stage performer was one of the only occupations available to women in the 6th century CE. So if you wanted to work and be more independent, you had very little choice rather than to go to the stage. This is important because it provides further context for Theodora's early life, and it isn't as black and white as some of our sources would have us believe. And shows that her theater career also may have been a necessary means to an end to further her later political causes. If we can go on to the next slide, I'll tell you more. So as Theodora grew older, she is said to have become increasingly involved with members of the higher social classes of Constantinople, probably through her performances, through her alleged role as a prostitute or a companion. It's a bit of a different connotation in the ancient world than it is in the than it is in today's day and age. Though she might not have known Justinian personally at this time, and in all likelihood she didn't, it is reasonable to believe that she was, at the very least, becoming known to other members of the elite by attending their parties. In fact, Procopius suggests that she would often go to the house of the notables, his word, not mine, for drinking and providing some manner of entertainment there. He doesn't give specifics on what. Procopius might have seen this as some sort of like unsavory debauchery or overall quote unquote poor behavior. But he could have also been exaggerating the frequency at which she visited these houses. Furthermore, what was going on at these parties may be more akin to like the Greek practice of the symposia, where like talented female performers would often provide the entertainment for the drinking and discussion going on, except for in Plato's. Theodora could well have used these opportunities provided by these gatherings to learn the nuances of political life and learn how to network with the upper echelons of society and work with those whom she would later rule. After a stint away from Constantinople, and there will be more on that later, what she was doing, once she returned, she had captured the attention of Justinian himself, who in and around 523 CE used his position to raise her social status to that of a patrician, and this will become important in a moment. Her impact on the political sphere, once she was elevated to the status, was almost immediate. We know that Justinian had convinced his uncle and predecessor, who was emperor at the time, Justin, to enact a law which would allow him to marry Theodora despite her background as an actress. Which directly contradicts one of Constantine's edicts that directly forbade this. I would assert that Theodora probably had some influence over this decision and getting Justinian to convince his uncle to pass such a law, in light of the fact that a caveat of this law was that the bride-to-be in question must be of patrician status in order to be exempt from needing the emperor's permission. Which had already been taken care of. Justinian had raised her to the status of patrician, so this was not a problem. Furthermore, this law also allowed Theodora's friends who had been raised to the status of patrician as well to marry higher status individuals, with a close friend called Antonina marrying Justinian's future primary general Belisarius. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Theodora's power and influence seems to have only grown as time went on, with Justinian even going so far as to exile a senior court official who had insulted her in some way. We're not sure how he insulted her, but we know that he was exiled from the court for committing such a crime. This suggests that Theodora was of extremely high standing in the court, at least where Justinian was concerned. She was powerful, most certainly where it counted. Therefore, making her essentially untouchable in terms of political life. Theodora's boldness and strength were further emphasized, however, when she was not only on Justinian's side on everything, she would openly debate him on various issues in the Senate in front of the royal court and in front of his peers on various issues. We are not given specific examples, but we know enough to know that this did indeed happen. And not only Theodora's willingness, but also her ability to openly contradict Justinian in the sentence shows not only her boldness, but her power and influence, which can be said to have far exceeded that of previous Roman empresses, whom we unfortunately hear very little of. At least as far as our sources are concerned, they may have had significant influence in their own right, but they were just simply not written about. It has indeed been said that Justinian himself publicly recognized her as his co-ruler. So there was not this dichotomy of the emperor is number one, and then empress is 1A type of thing. There was no such dichotomy here. It strongly suggested that she was at minimum on par with Justinian in terms of her political power and influence, and the furthest thing from simply a figurehead, as we have seen in previous eras of Roman history. Theodora's influence was not only relegated to the political sphere, however, and it certainly extended into times of turmoil as well. And if we could flip the slide, I will explain exactly how. Yes, in the title of this slide, "Purple is a fine burial shroud," her famous quote from the case of the now infamous Nika riots. Just a little background on the riots themselves. The riots began in the Hippodrome, which was connected to the royal palace where Theodora and Justinian lived primarily. And they were reportedly incited by those who were growing increasingly disconcerted with Justinian and his rule for various reasons. Some members of these groups felt that Justinian was treating them unfairly in terms of law decisions and were favoring others. Things were becoming increasingly dire for the royal household when the rioters had named a man called Hypatius emperor and actually placed him on the royal throne in the Forum. By all accounts, Justinian and the court's plan was to outright flee Constantinople and regroup elsewhere. Theodora, however, seemingly refused to relinquish her hard-won status as empress and show her back to any potential usurpers. She encouraged, if not demanded, Justinian to remain in Constantinople and resist the insurrection. She rationalized her position by remarking that purple makes a fine burial shroud, indicating that she would have rather have run the risk of perishing in a position of boldness and in pride, rather than to simply abdicate the throne and flee. Justinian was apparently swayed by his wife's courage and elected to stay and face the increasing level of violence in the streets of Constantinople. The incident did end with the army being turned loose upon the populace and droves of civilians being killed within the Hippodrome, numbering, according to Procopius, around 30,000. Despite the grim nature of the fate that befell these vaguely unarmed civilians, and the somewhat questionable morality of unleashing the military upon the civilians, nevertheless, Theodora's authority and influence is nevertheless on full display here. It is clear that she was able to have, at minimum, marginal influence over how and when the military was deployed, even convincing Justinian to go as far as unleashing them upon their own citizens. At least she caused the military option to be considered at all. If we can change over the slide, her influence also extended to the religious sphere as well. It is known that during the 6th century, Monophysite Christians were being persecuted in the Eastern Roman Empire, and basically being ordered to give up their positions in various churches around the eastern half of the empire. Once again, referring to Justin, the immediate predecessor of Justinian and his uncle, had in fact ordered that any who stood against the Chalcedonian Creed, which they subscribed to, ought to be arrested. Furthermore, he decreed that the bishops were to accept Chalcedonian doctrine, or they would have their positions confiscated, and they themselves would be arrested. So the big question about this background is, why does that matter? Like, what does this have to do with Theodora? Well, when Theodora had taken her time away from Constantinople that I mentioned earlier, she ended up in Alexandria in Egypt, where many Monophysites had gone to seek refuge. While there, she is said to have converted to this branch of Christianity and developed quite an affinity for them, which put her unknowingly on a direct collision course with Justinian and his family's views on Christianity and the established imperial type of Christianity that was to be perpetuated in the empire. When Theodora had gained a measure of power in the Byzantine world or the Eastern Roman world, the Monophysites are said to have known her as a friend and ally at the royal court and came to her for help when about 55 bishops were expelled and relegated to Petra. In fact, she did not stand idly by and allow this, however. She convinced Justinian to allow these exiles to find refuge in Alexandria, where she herself had lived for a time. Despite not even yet being his wife at this point. This was prior to their marriage and her ascension to the throne as empress. A further example of her ability to influence things in the religious sphere is that when a man called Harith ibn Jabala, apologies if I butchered that name, was in Constantinople, he asked for Theodora for help in establishing a Monophysite bishop in his tribe, and she is said to have agreed without even hesitating or without consulting Justinian. Like, she did not ask his blessing whatsoever. She simply acted in her own agency. Circumventing Justinian was in this way was no small thing, especially considering that his views were more orthodox than hers, and he may not have supported her decision had she asked him. In fact, I'm certain she knew he would say no, so she didn't ask, and dispensed with the debate altogether. She was also known as a great builder of churches as well. If we can flip the slide, please. Theodora was responsible for a great many architectural additions to Constantinople and beyond, and was herself the subject of various works of art during her time. She is said to have been the impetus for the creation of a church called the Church of Sergius and Bacchus during the 530s CE. This church is connected to Theodora's affinity for the Monophysite Christians, as I've mentioned, and it is thought to have been something of a shelter for them within Constantinople. There is an inscription which is reportedly still on the church itself that refers to Theodora herself as a, quote, God-crowned Theodora. The significance of this is that it indicates that Justinian was not first in terms of receiving credit for this, or at the very least did not receive sole credit for the building of this church, and that it was given to Theodora instead, which is somewhat different than the procedure that we have seen in the past, where it is usually the emperor that is given credit for a lot of architectural undertakings, especially in Rome and Constantinople. And in terms of her portrayal in artwork, Theodora has appeared in multiple works, including the famous Ravenna mosaic. Another example, however, is a painting in one church in a city called Ephesus that depicts her alongside Justinian being crowned by Jesus himself. So this is extremely powerful iconography, suggesting that not only Justinian, but also Theodora was portrayed as having a strong connection to God, and also being crowned as his equal. This is very much reminiscent of earlier imperial iconography when the Roman pantheon was still the primary religion of Rome. Emperors such as the very first Augustus would often make a point of making his connection to divinity. It seems that this has continued even under the different religion. But the major difference between this instance and anything under Augustus is that, or any later emperor, is that the empress is presented as equal to the emperor. And one of the last things I want to say here is that Theodora's building projects went beyond religion as well, and beyond the confines of Constantinople. We know, in fact, that she was responsible for founding a convent of sorts that served as a refuge for women who had left the stage life but couldn't really re-enter the upper echelons of society as she had. So she was undertaking a measure of activism in her own right to provide safe places for people who had had similar lifestyles to herself. And we just flip the slide one last time. So just some conclusions. What I want, or what I think the takeaways of this presentation are, is that the exceptionality of what Theodora was able to accomplish in her life and reign as empress. She was able to overcome a wildly stigmatized profession of her early life and rise to not only a prominent position in the royal court, but to being one of the most, if not the most, well-known Roman empress in history, perhaps alongside Livia Drusilla, the first Roman empress, which is somewhat poetic that things seem to have come full circle, and not only full circle, but having exceeded anything that we had seen before. And in Theodora's influence extended to a variety of arenas, from politics to religion to defense of the empire and her position, and finally in architecture as well. So thank you all for listening to my story today, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Wonderful. All right. So I see we've already got one question right off the bat. So Elise.
Yes.
Okay, this could be like a weird question. I kind of have a few. Was the work in her earlier days a necessity, or was it a choice? And do we know of what she would have been paid as an actress? Because if it was kind of stigmatized for women to do it, like, did she make more or less or the same as a man?
I don't know about the wage gap. That's something I could try to look into. I didn't find anything about what exactly she was paid for being an actress. I think maybe like enough to live, at least enough to buy at least small scraps of food here and there. But in terms of necessity versus choice, I think that it might have been a little bit of both. She could have chosen to sort of live a life of obscurity and like not go into the stage, life, and just become like, I hate this term, but a typical Roman wife. But she chose not to. But the necessity aspect comes in with, she wouldn't have had many other options to pursue a career. So, and especially considering her family's history, being on stage and everything like that, that's, her options were fairly limited for the career that she could have chosen. But I think through her own agency, she made the absolute best that she could out of that situation, and realized that it could be a path to bigger and better things. So hopefully that answers your question as best I can.
All right. I don't know who put up their participation hand first, but Dr. Funky.
So I have a couple questions about her being an actress, and this is partially my ignorance of that period and my ignorance of sort of late antique Roman law. So she's an actress, and actors and actresses, at least in the Republican and the early imperial period, are infamous. And by that I mean INFAMIS in Latin, right? So they don't have certain rights, and a lot of them are in fact enslaved or freed people. So I wonder if we know anything about Theodora, about her origins. You know, was she maybe enslaved at one point? And then a second point that is actually just more of a comment, but is that we see lots of actresses and pantomime actresses, right? So the dancers, and I think that's what Theodora was, who are involved with really powerful men. So Mark Antony, for a time, is involved with a woman named Volumnia Cytheris, who's a pantomime dancer too. And there seems to be some, as I think you pointed out, some flexibility in their status where they get access to these really powerful people. Anyways, I'll go back to my first question. Do you think that she might have been enslaved or of a different status at some point?
I think she certainly was of a fairly low status. Maybe perhaps her family, like her family, her parentage may have been a part of the slave classes. That's some speculation there. I'm not sure. I don't think we have any concrete evidence of their actual status. We just know they were fairly low in the pecking order. They weren't. They certainly weren't high status individuals that had a lot of rights. Much like in the early imperial, late Republican period, they were sort of stigmatized. especially with the advent of Christianity. I know a lot of bishops and high-ranking clerical officials tried to have these performances banned because of their alleged lewdness and various things that were going on stage and off stage. But the emperors wouldn't allow them to be banned because they gave the people such entertainment. So it's like still this bread and circuses type deal that you need to keep the people happy to an extent, and they liked these performances. So the emperors sort of ignored the religious officials on that one. But I would still say they were certainly heavily stigmatized and very low status individuals in comparison to some members of their audience, and certainly compared to the elites of Constantinople society. So yeah, she had a long way to go to get from where she started to where she ended. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't know who's next. I think it may have been Dr. Miller. I'm not sure. There was lots of hands going up at once.
Well, my question comes on, sort of carries on Dr. Funke's question, so maybe it makes sense. I just wondered about the kind of historiographical question about sources for this sort of thing. Like, it seems to me, I'm being a skeptic, I admit, but with respect to like making a woman who has undue influence over a man, happens to be an actress and prostitute, it seems to fit, and I'm glad Dr. Funke mentioned Mark Antony. It fits into kind of a cliche of tyrannical men throughout Greek and Roman history who are always like ruled by their passions and often have women who have sort of undue influence over them. So I just wondered if you have, I don't know the sources exactly for Theodora and Justinian's reign. Like I know Procopius. So I just wondered, you know, and I know Procopius maybe doesn't really like them, but I just wondered if there is a way like you've sort of thought of to how to kind of push against them, you know, to sort of read against that sort of tradition, or if there is indeed other sources, maybe epigraphical evidence or whatnot, I don't know anything about it, they can kind of challenge these, what might be cliches. Maybe they're true as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In terms of the sources, yeah, a lot of it's Procopius. And there's sort of two sides of Procopius in the way he talks about Justinian and Theodora. There's like the more public view he had of them that he wrote in like his buildings and his, you know, his work on the wars and things like that. But then there's his secret history that he wrote that he might not have ever intended to be read publicly. That where he blasts the two of them for various things, including Theodora's level of influence that he claims Justinian allowed her to have. But I don't think he certainly wasn't a fan of that at all. And I remember when I was writing my essay, this was a couple of years ago that I actually wrote this. It was a lot of sources came from him, but how I managed to really get around that and sort of find those flaws in his critiques of her and them is sort of just trying to take it with a grain of salt and like assuming there's a lot of exaggeration going on here. Like I think, like I said at one point, Procopius says that, you know, she was frequenting the houses of these noblemen a lot, like very often. I'm assuming that's quite an exaggeration about how often she was actually attending these things. I think there might be some truth to it that she was an actress and that she was like on stage, had a life on stage, but what she was actually doing on stage might be a bit of exaggeration, like might be a bit of, like, I would go as far as to say like something of slander, like you know, he doesn't like her, so he's trying to make her sound as bad as possible, exactly like, you know, like you said, like we did with Mark Antony and his lover, like with Cleopatra, like same thing was done to Cleopatra, like not the life on stage part, but like demonizing her as like this tyrannical individual. So yeah, I think it is a product of the literary tradition, how these powerful women are treated when they are not ignored entirely, unfortunately. But so hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, it's like these literary, like elite male literary writers, like they can't imagine how and why a woman would want to have an influence, or maybe, and then like how she would get influence other than
by being a sex worker. Like that's the only way it could happen, right? And that's obviously what she would want to do. Like this kind of, I mean, it's such an ingrained, like deeply ingrained sexist view that it's really hard to get.
Yeah, like surely she can't just be an intelligent, powerful woman who was able to navigate the political sphere with Augustin-like expertise and perhaps maybe even better than him.
Right.
Like, no, surely can't be that, right? But which is unfortunate, honestly. But hopefully, with this paper, I tried to sort of break that a little bit. And like, no, she was just as powerful as Justinian, if not more, whether Procopius liked it or not. Like, that was how it was.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks very much, Spencer.
No problem. I think Dr. Rapat, she's next on the row.
Hi, Spencer. Thanks. That was really interesting. And actually, I just had kind of a historiographical question too, because I was thinking as you were speaking, when Theodora essentially is the emperor at various points, and I was thinking like, other emperors, or male emperors at least, are so commonly said to have a role model, right? There's somebody that they're trying to be like, and it often seems that in fact that's the case. They were trying to be like so and so, but it's also a way for other people to kind of understand them, right? And I was wondering, so is Theodora, did she have a role model? Like, is she given a role model? And if she is, I guess, who is it? And if she isn't, is that significant, do you suppose?
That's a really good question. I was actually hoping somebody would ask me something like that, is because she's not expressly given a role model, but I would imagine that she is following the footsteps of somebody like Livia. Like Theodora was a very well-read person, especially seeing as the quote about the burial shroud, like purple being a fine burial shroud. She's actually not the first person to say that. Like it was actually, she was, I don't know if she was doing it on purpose, but I like to think she was doing it on purpose. Referencing a quote from, I think it was the 430s BC, like a Syracusan king who was under a similar situation. He was under siege. He was, he was having a bad time. And he said something similar about like, I'm not going to run away from this. Like I'd rather die a king than like live as somebody who just ran away and like gave up my throne and gave up my power. So from that, I was able to think like maybe she was very well read about her political history, about her Greek history. Like, she was able to almost quote him, like somebody who had said something many centuries before. And so I don't think she has like expressly a role model given, and I think that might be even more significant because she was the role model, right? For I know empresses, like the next couple empresses in line after her, we hear more about them as well than you would think would be standard. So I think she might have also been the role model for future empresses, and she might have, broken the proverbial glass ceiling of her own right. Like she was like, I can make something happen here that maybe nobody's done before. Like a uniquely ambitious and talented individual was Theodora, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. And Dr. Lohi, I think you're next.
Thank you for that. Yeah, very interesting. Thought-provoking. I guess as I was thinking through that, I was struck by the fact that, I can't really think of any exact parallel for Theodora, because normally the emperor marries like a wife from sort of a senatorial status, and here it's just an obvious difference. And it was also kind of generally, if because the time Justinian is a very transitional time, the curial class really ends at this point as a class. Like the consulship as a regular annual institution ends at this time. So would you say that, just the fact that things are changing kind of gives Theodora a window of opportunity? It's something that could have happened right then that would have been harder to happen earlier or later?
I think so. Like I think that could certainly be possible. Like with things in so much flux at that point. I think that certainly afforded her a fairly unique opportunity that others may not have had. But I think that was very. I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's could be an instance a very opportunistic a moment for her that she took full advantage of. So yeah, I'm gonna think on that more.
Thanks for that.
No problem. Dr. Whaley, what's
Yes, thank you for that, and thank you to the other presenters too. I enjoyed all the stuff. Just one of the interesting things about the comment and then a little question about the Procopius's negativity. So one of the interesting things with this case is that we have like two quite different traditions. We have like the classical classicizing tradition of Procopius, who wrote like Herodotus, blah, blah, blah. But we have these other sources writing in Syriac and other languages that have an entirely different take on her. Like they think she's great, just sort of, there's no question about her moral upstanding character or whatever, in the same way that there is with this sort of very sort of classical, misogyny or whatever. So and it comes down partly to the religious background too, but it's quite an interesting thing. So I was just curious, a little hypothetical question, because so there's no, if you can't answer. So because she's so prominent and has such a big role in his life, and then dies 548, and so some 20 years before he does. Do you think his reign could have gone down a lot differently? Could have, things could have gone better, plague aside, if she had been around longer to provide, I don't know, to do all the things that she'd done before that she wasn't around to do?
I like questions like this because it gives me free reign to speculate. I think things could have, like you said, irrespective of the plague kind of, I mean, nothing we can do about plagues, right? I didn't even think of that. That was not on purpose. But yeah, I think things might have gone better if she had stuck around, because I think she provided that balance to Justinian's reign that, like, sure, he had, hashtag relatable, because I think throughout his reign when she was alive, I think he had a different kind of sounding board almost to like help with make decisions, to help make ideas, to help better Constantinople, like rather than just talking to his royal court, who probably would have just told him what he wanted to hear a lot of the time, like in the senatorial class, like, oh, we can't, Justinian's always right type of thing. Theodora was not like that at all. Like, as we know, she openly debated him in the Senate, and I think that made him a better emperor. Like having that person who would call him out, like if she said, no, that's a terrible idea, like, and after she died, maybe he didn't have that anymore, so he was kind of on his own where he hadn't been before, and having to deal with the Senate on his own, having to make decisions on his own, that sort of thing. And their very close relationship in general, like by all accounts they were extremely close, and like there was, like, it wasn't a political marriage, like there was real, like they really loved each other, honestly. And like maybe like her dying 20 years before he did, 20 years without like the woman he had ruled with this entire time, that might have affected him as well, like from a psychological standpoint. Like, so he might not have been in as clear of a head as he would have been had his companion still been alive, unfortunately. But yeah, so maybe that's my hot take on that she made him a better emperor. And Burke?
It may have been mentioned and I just forgot it, but are there any sources at all, like directly from her, since she was such a prominent figure?
I wouldn't say there are any written sources from her. I don't think so. I couldn't find any. I would say the sources, like where we see, like where we hear her voice, is really in like the architecture that she had a direct hand in creating. Like we can tell a lot about her by like the way she wanted to, she took such pains to better Constantinople, to build these churches, to build these, these refuges for people, like all around the eastern part of the empire. I think that's where we hear her voice, honestly, is in those things that are still standing today, a lot of them. And like the iconography of her, like how people, like besides Procopius, who like told us about her through images, like I think that's where we really hear her voice, and like not in writing, but like you tell a lot about who she was as a person and how beloved she really was by your average person, as opposed to salty Procopius. But like like, I think that's where we get her voices and those things, but no writing from her, unfortunately. I would love to have writing from her, but see what she actually thought about stuff, but like, well, unfortunately, we don't. Anybody else?
Sorry, just a follow-up question. Was there any reference to her like ever having had written a book or whatever, and it just was lost, or did she just not write, as far as we know?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I don't think, though, there's any reference. Dr. Whitley shaking his head, so I'm going to go with him. That no, I don't think so. Like she probably like spoke publicly, but I don't think she like ever like sat down and wrote anything like we have like Claudius's history that he said that he wrote but is lost now. We don't have anything like that, unfortunately. That would have been cool. But Dr. Lohidi.
Yeah, just about the things that she wrote. I mean, I kind of thought immediately of Justinian's legislation. Of course, her name is never behind that. And if she was behind the laws, it would have probably gone through a few layers of kind of writing. But I'm just wondering if that's a possibility for
maybe, yeah.
Theory, something, because like the legislation can get quite opinionated. The emperors give what's ostensibly their opinion.
Yeah.
But of course, her name's like, it's never her name. It's always Justinian's name. So
yeah. Maybe she could have had like some consulting role and that sort of thing or something. Just went out under his name, just because I mean she couldn't. Unfortunately, she couldn't circumvent everything. But some laws or some practices, I guess, still stuck around with laws being published under emperors' names, not empresses. But she might have had some influence there, like maybe told him like, hey, you should put this in, type of thing, or like maybe like take that clause out or something like you said in the writing process. Like she might have had a hand in the editing or first drafts.
It's just a note. Like we do have like some inscriptions in North Africa that they're dedicated to Justinian and Theodora, interestingly enough, in some Latin, some buildings and stuff. And I think there might be some in Egypt too. You get some official documents that are Justinian and Theodora. And then if you go a few decades later, Sophia, there's some other ones that have just, yeah. So that's Chris's. That's quite cool. And I'm mute now.